With Cape Media News Conversations, I'm Sarah Colvin. All eyes are on Texas as the recovery following Hurricane Harvey continues. What's on locals' minds? What if that were to happen here? Joining me today in studio, I welcome Joe Gordon. He's the Emergency Management Director at the Barnstable County Sheriff's Office. Joe, thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to talk a little bit about the impacts of Harvey, and we're going to talk about how we're preparing for an emergency here on Cape Cod. So thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Sarah, for having me, and these are definitely conversations that need to be happening throughout the region, and they are happening.
Absolutely. So let's talk, first I want to talk a little bit about observations in terms of Harvey. Of course, a landmark storm, a devastation like really we haven't seen in so many years, major flooding, tens of thousands of people displaced, homes destroyed. What have you observed in looking at the storm, looking at the emergency response, and perhaps comparing it to other storms that we've seen?
Well, a couple things stand out with this storm. It came in as a Category 4 storm at 130 mile per hour winds, and then it stalled out. However, it sat over the area and it dumped a devastating amount of rainfall in the area, causing the flooding that we've seen. As we all know, down in Houston area, we've seen animals such as alligators ending up in people's houses, snakes and so forth. But one of the things that people don't grasp is that when flooding does happen, electricity doesn't go well with water. So getting people out of their homes, getting them to dry land, to shelters and so forth is really important to safeguarding human life. Absolutely,
and certainly dangerous as well. I know that the electricity can electrify the water, so making it almost impassable, making it in and of itself a danger. So let's talk a little bit about storm surge, because I think that we think about the winds, we think about the weather, but really looking at all of the water damage that's happening in Texas, as well as going back several years with Hurricane Sandy in New Jersey and New York. It's the water that is causing the biggest problems.
And that's something that we have to be very aware of here on Cape Cod because of the elevation of the Cape. Storm surge is something big. For example, with Hurricane Harvey, you had 130 mile per hour winds coming in. And the storm surge got up to just right around 7.5 feet, which is higher than normal as the water rolls in. And there's no stopping that water. What happened with Sandy is Sandy wasn't a hurricane. It started off as a hurricane. It became what was known as a superstorm because it started off as a hurricane, but it evolved about 2 hours before, I think the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration said before it hit landfill, it turned into what they call a nor'easter. And there are some differences in there. But Sandy was at 70 mile per hour winds, okay? Not hurricane strength, but 70 mile per hour winds. It brought in over a 12.5 foot storm surge because of the high tide. So when you think winds, people are talking about the winds, 130 mile per hour versus 70 mile per hour. I look at the tide, because the tide is going to impact the land as the surge rolls in, and that's something that we have to be very cognizant of right here in Cape Cod.
Absolutely. So it's really the timing of the storm. So if the major impact of the storm happens during a high tide, that's really when we have to worry. I mean, we have to worry anytime, but that can cause more damage at high tide than it can at low tide.
There's no question. You're going to get wind damage. You're going to get trees knocked down, power lines knocked down. You're going to have roofs impacted by the wind. It's the storm surge of the ocean that can really devastate our region.
Sure, and of course now we're keeping an eye on Irma. I mean, we're in the height of hurricane season, September traditionally when we see these storms, especially here on the East Coast. Any concerns as to Irma's track up here on Cape Cod, and any kind of preliminary talks about preparing here on Cape Cod?
Well, looking at what they call the spaghetti models of all the different models that lay out there right now, it looks like the Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Florida area is really going to get devastated. And Irma, as I just was reading a report before our newscast here, was that it is now at a sustained winds of 175 miles per hour, which is a Category 5, which is very, very troubling wherever it goes. But I don't see, right now, what I'm seeing for the track, I don't see it impacting New England. However, we could potentially get some after effects from it.
Sure, but being prepared is always important. So talk to me a little bit about your role as Emergency Management Director, especially this time of year. What kind of things are you paying attention to, and what kind of things are you working on in terms of making sure that we are prepared for an emergency here on the Cape?
Well, I represent the sheriff on the Barnstable County Regional Emergency Planning Committee, and the committee meets monthly. We have a meeting tomorrow. It's usually the first Wednesday of the month at the county complex in Barnstable. It's composed of people, all the fire chiefs, the police chiefs throughout the Cape, all of our volunteer organizations active in disasters such as American Red Cross and so forth. All your utility companies are there. The Massachusetts Emergency Management Agency has representatives there. And we meet monthly to go over just plans and ideas and things that are coming that we see, lessons that we learn from tabletop exercises. We also have a shelter task force that meets just prior to that meeting. And so I'll be at that as well tomorrow. And recently, the Shelter Task Force did walkthroughs of 3 of their 6 regional shelters on the Cape with American Red Cross representatives, just to see that this is how the layout is of the shelter, and we meet all the criteria that is required by us.
What kind of things should we as citizens keep in mind or kind of do to prepare ourselves for an emergency? I think being prepared, I think getting off Cape is a massive challenge in the events of emergency. So we really have to be thinking about sheltering in place or the proximity of those shelters that are so well positioned here on the Cape. But what should we be doing? What should we have on hand?
The first thing you have to do is you have to pay attention to what the news is out there. So Irma right now is down. It's hasn't hit Cuba yet, but it's down there, and people really have to pay attention to that. That's the first thing, because if you're going to evacuate here on Cape Cod, as we know, you have to leave a couple days in advance. If you think that you're going to leave on a Monday morning to get off the Cape before a storm hits on Tuesday morning, you're in for a rude awakening, as we see with traffic congestion with the bridges where the bottlenecks are. So that's the first thing. Plan ahead. If you're going to leave, do it a couple days ahead of time. Don't get stuck in traffic. The second thing is, if you're going to you shelter in place, there's a lot of things you should do. And FEMA has some really good tips on their website. American Red Cross has some really good tips on their websites. You can Google this stuff. You do Yahoo searches on your internet. But making sure that you have canned goods that can plenty of water on hand. You should have at least a gallon a day for 3 days. I would recommend a lot more than that per person. And just things like that. But start thinking ahead of time. Move all your belongings up to your top level of your floors, because as we saw in Houston, a lot of devastation with the floods.
And are we at risk, again, thinking about that storm surge, I would think that we are at risk for floods here on the Cape, perhaps not to the extent that Houston was, just because of the sheer, the infrastructure there is a little different than the infrastructure here, but of course our geography is pretty darn close to the ocean.
Yeah, we're always at risk for flood, and it doesn't have to be from a storm surge, from a hurricane or a nor'easter. It could be from torrential downrain, and we saw that recently.
We did.
We had a lot of rainfall occur in a matter of a couple hours right here, and we've seen houses get devastated. So I recommend that people go out and they talk to their insurance agencies throughout the Cape and do their homework and make sure that they have flood insurance, because typically most of your natural disasters that occur in America are from flooding, okay? And most of your deaths that occur because of a disaster events are due to flooding. So 75% of the national disaster assistance that goes out is due to flooding. So flooding is nothing to take for granted, because we've been living on the Cape. I grew up here. I'm a product of the Cape, and I've never seen anything that's devastated my family. But you got to have those safeguards in place, and I would recommend that people go out, do their homework, get some flood insurance, because on average it's about just over $20,000 they see just for flood damage to individual homeowners.
Wow, and so certainly make sure that you are protected and be aware that the floods might come. Water, big enemy to homeowners, no matter where you are.
The other thing is that you got to know what your coverage is going to cover, because it's not going to cover everything. But like in my house, my furnace, my water boiler, they're in the basement, so I got to be aware of that. If something were to happen, how do I offset those costs? A lot of people depend on disaster assistance from the federal government. However, the President of the United States has to declare an emergency for disaster assistance monies to be available, number one. And number two, that money is given as grants, usually with interest, so you have to pay it back. My advice, get yourself some flood insurance.
Great. So Joe, in terms of local preparation, I know that we really do, with the Regional Emergency Planning Committee, have a great coordinated effort. Would you say that we are ready to act in the event of an emergency, and if people want to learn more or get more informed on how they can help, how's the best way for them to learn more about that?
I think we're ahead of the curve in comparison to other parts of the state. That's just my observation, but not just my observation, that's things that I hear throughout the state as I go around and interact with my colleagues. But with the Regional Emergency Planning Committee, and prior, even before them, long ago, all the fire departments and the police departments on the Cape have always worked well together. So the communication structure is there. Everybody knows who's the players are. We all get along, we all work together, we all know we have to collaborate. That's the first thing I can say. Is it gonna save us and keep us safe completely? No, but I think we're gonna respond much better. And you had me on the show recently with the Major Crisis Relief Fund. I can't say it enough. The Cape Cod Major Crisis Relief Fund is a nonprofit organization set up under the Cape Cod Needy Fund. And anytime we see a disaster, and I said this on the last time you had me on here, anytime there's a disaster, there's the scam artists that come out with these fraudulent websites for people to donate money, and people get scammed out of money that's well intended for a good cause. We're getting ahead of the curve with the Major Crisis Relief Fund. We've raised over $300,000, and you can Google them as well to find out how to go about doing that. I don't want to go down because we talked about this.
No, I think that's great, though. It's always good to have a reminder about that Major Crisis Relief Fund because it is existing. It is there to help with things that maybe insurance can help with or other things. So it's great that there's $300,000 already in that. And you raise a really wonderful point, especially in the times following a crisis, the scammers are out there. So you want to make sure that you're fully vetting where your donation dollars are going. So a local organization like the Major Crisis Relief Fund, very safe to be able to send your money to.
Right, and we saw that, like I said before, during Sandy, more than 1,000 fraudulent scam websites jumped up from all over the world. You don't know where they are, so it's best to be safe than sorry, and that's why Major Crisis Relief Fund came out. So that's one of the other components. But the REPC, the Regional Emergency Planning Committee, all your fire chiefs and police chiefs, your public safety agency, the sheriff's office, the Massachusetts Emergency Management Agency, and all your volunteer organizations, they work together. They work together on the REPC. They do a lot of tabletop exercises throughout the year. So there's a good core. Everybody knows how to contact each other. So if something were to happen, I think the response is going to be dynamic compared to other areas. I think our recovery efforts will be much better prepared because of things like as the professional collaborations and the Major Crisis Relief Fund, and hopefully we can build that fund up. But we're not out of the woods by any stretch of the imagination. I don't want people to get complacent, but I think we're far ahead of the curve compared to other locales.
Fantastic. Well, Joe, thank you so much for joining me today, and thank you for all your hard work on making sure that we'll be ready if disaster strikes Cape Cod.
Thank you, Sarah, very much.
Thank you. Joe Gordon is the Emergency Management Director with the Barnstable County Sheriff's Office. With Cape Media News, I'm Sarah Colvin.